So let's go ahead and take a look at the deficit, surplus, and national debt. Even though all three of these terms sound very similar to one another, they do mean three very different things for us. So let's go ahead and take a look at it, a few of the applications, and a few calculations as well. The deficit is the amount by which annual government spending exceeds tax revenues. So if the government spends more than it takes in as revenues, we are going to be running some type of deficit. So our deficit pretty close to $1 trillion now. So in the current year, we've spent $1 trillion more than we actually took in as tax revenues. So therefore, we are going to be producing a deficit. And a deficit is only going to be for one particular year. So we can take a look at the deficit for 2019, 2020, 2021, and then so on. Just for one particular year, we can calculate out a deficit. Along the same lines, we can calculate out a surplus, the amount by which annual tax revenues exceed government spending. So if we actually spend less than we actually take in tax revenues, then we're going to be running a surplus. And the last time we ran a surplus was during Clinton's administration in the 90s. So I think for maybe only 1 or 2 years we ran a surplus. And just like with a deficit, a surplus is only going to be given for one particular year. So say 1998, we ran a surplus. We can say, hey, we spent less than we took in as tax revenues. So for this particular year, we ran a surplus. And then finally here we have the national debt, the total accumulation of past deficits less surpluses. So when we add up all the deficits, all the surpluses that the United States has had since its inception, we get the national debt. And our national debt, pretty close to $25 trillion now, probably going to be even higher when we account for all the stimulus spending that we're having right now. So here the national debt is actually going to be the sum of all the deficits minus all the surpluses. So one thing to note is that the national debt, the larger it becomes, that just tells us that we're running deficit year after year. So deficits are actually going to be added into the national debt. If we happen to run a surplus, then the surplus is actually going to be subtracted out of the national debt. So here, just a little bit of terminology with all of this. So deficits added to the national debt. If we run a surplus for a given year, it's going to be subtracted out of our national debt, meaning that the debt actually gets smaller. So let's go ahead and take a look at a few examples, very quick examples, just simple mathematics right here, taking a look at all three of these concepts. So examples. Example number one, suppose I just give you two particular numbers. Suppose that I tell you tax revenues is equal to 1,400. So maybe just say $1.4 trillion right here. So 1,400. Then I give you that government spending is equal to 1,600. So 1,600, maybe $1.6 trillion. First question that we can ask is, are we running a deficit or are we running a surplus, and of how much? So we know that we're going to be running a deficit because spending is greater than revenue. So anytime spending is greater than tax revenues, we immediately know that we are going to be hit with a deficit. In the opposite case, if spending is less than revenues, then we're going to have a surplus. But in this instance, we notice that, hey, spending is greater than revenue, so we are running a deficit for this particular year. And how much of a deficit do we have? We simply just need to go ahead and take the difference between these two numbers. So our deficit is equal to 1,400 minus 1,600, which gives us $200 or $200 billion worth of a deficit. And in this particular section, we really don't make a notation of positive or negative signs. We just want to go ahead and say, is our spending greater than our revenues? If we are, we're running a deficit. Is our revenues greater than our spending? Then we're running a surplus. Just taking the difference between these two numbers will be enough for us to say how much of a surplus or deficit we're running. Next, we can go ahead and take a look at example number two. So put a little line under here. Example number two is going to include 3 straight consecutive deficits. So suppose that we run a deficit of $300 in, say, 2018. We run another deficit of $500 in 2019. And then suppose here we have another deficit of, say, $600 in 2020. So in this instance, the main sort of conclusion that you should be drawing from this is when we run deficits year after year, the national debt should be getting larger. So the question that we are going to ask is, how much is added to the national debt? So we don't want to confuse deficit and debt, because deficits, remember, are for one given year, while the debt is going to be the past sum of all deficits and surpluses. Here, because we run 3 straight deficits, remember that if we run a deficit, the national debt gets larger. So simply all we need to do is add these 3 numbers together. So 300 plus 500 plus 600, we notice that our national debt has gotten larger by $1,400. So in this instance, remember that deficits are going to be added to the national debt, but instead if we had a surplus, say maybe 3 consecutive surpluses, then it'd be subtracted out from the national debt. And of course, we can go ahead, do deficits, surpluses, do a kind of mixture or combination of both, but now you have a better idea of that deficits are added to the national debt while surpluses are going to be subtracted out. And then the final question that we can ask, another very simple question, is just going to be combining both of these examples. So suppose that I tell you that tax revenues are equal to 2,800, so changing up numbers just a little bit. Government spending is equal to 3,200. And then suppose that our national debt is equal to 1,000. And this is all going to be for the year 2019. So 2019. So in the year 2019, we started off with a national debt of $1,000. We had tax revenues equal to 2,800, and we had government spending equal to 3,200. Question that we're going to ask here is, what is our new national debt in the next year? So what is national debt at beginning of 2020? At beginning of 2020. So all we're going to do is just combine both of the examples that we did previously into one question. So first of all, are we running a deficit or are we running a surplus? Once again, because revenues are smaller than spending, we know that we're going to be running a deficit. So a deficit, and how much does our deficit equal? Our deficit is going to equal to 2,800 minus 3,200. Our deficit equals to 400. So in the year 2019, we ran a deficit of $400. And remember, because we are running a deficit, it needs to be added into the national debt. So our national debt is going to be what our debt was at the beginning of 2019, so $1,000, plus the deficit that we ran in 2019, 400. So at the beginning of the year 2020, our national debt is going to equal to $1,400. So here, combining all 3 of these terms into one another, remember they do mean very different things, even though they do sound very similar to one another. With all of this, you may be a little bit interested in seeing the deficit, surpluses, and debt in application. So there's actually a pretty good website. You can go ahead and Google it. It's called the Debt Clock. And there's actually a pretty big green billboard in New York City, if you're ever there, that actually shows the debt for the United States, and it keeps on just running and running. So I think it's down one of the avenues, maybe 5th or 6th Avenue. It's actually a pretty unassuming sign, but if you're ever in New York City, in the area, you can actually see the debt clock on one of the buildings. So if we click on the site right here, the US debt clock, you're going to notice that these numbers just keep on running and running and running, and they basically give us a lot of information about the state of the United States' economy. So this big number that we see right here, the US national debt, pretty close to $25 trillion. So if we add up all the past deficits and surpluses in terms of the United States, we've actually spent $25 trillion more than we've taken in as tax revenues, which is essentially a very astounding amount. It's a huge number when you really think about it. This $75,036 per debt per citizen, it just tells us that if we wanted to get out of debt right now, every single citizen would have to give the government $75,000. And I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of us don't have that amount. So here, that's just a sort of theoretical sort of application of seeing exactly how much each citizen needs to pay in order for us to get out of the debt. We have spending for this current year, roughly about $6 trillion, and we actually have a current deficit, U.S. federal current deficit of $2.5 trillion. So if for this given year, we've actually spent $2.5 trillion more than we've taken in as tax revenues, it's a very, very high deficit. So it's almost historic at how much spending that we've done in this current year. We have tax revenue right here, so about $3.5 trillion worth of tax revenues. So when we go ahead and take the tax revenue, subtract out all the spending, that's exactly where we get the deficit right now. We have US GDP, so roughly about $22 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio, so 115.18%. So when we take this GDP against the national debt, we know that, hey, the national debt is larger than GDP. So here our debt to GDP ratio is greater than 100%. Where are we spending all of our monies? So the largest items that we said are things that we've already hit on: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. So these mandatory spending. We also have interest on the national debt, and also defense and war, this component of discretionary spending. We see a lot of debt for the US citizens as well. So we pay a lot of interest because we have to borrow a lot of money. We notice that, hey, student loan debt right here, almost $1.7 trillion worth of student loan debt, equates to about $37,000 per student. This is one of the fastest growing amounts of debt that we have here in the US. We also see credit card debt. It has surpassed credit card debt, about $1.1 trillion. So these are just really astounding amounts of money just flowing in and out of the US economy. We see that US debt, about $7 trillion worth of our US debt are held by foreign countries. So China, Japan, United Kingdom, Canada, they hold a lot of US debt as well. And that's going to be a sort of implication that we're going to be taking a look at. The US trade deficit, because we export less than we import, we notice that we run a trade deficit with countries worldwide. The biggest country, of course, being China. And we just see a lot of other sort of demographic information that we've talked about before. So here's population, there's the unemployment rate, here's some type of money, sort of money creation. So this debt clock right here just gives us a whole bunch of ideas of exactly here, right here and now, exactly the state of the US economy in terms of a few different measures. And you notice that these numbers are just going to keep on climbing and climbing and climbing because the United States is going to continue to keep on spending money and money year after year after year. So you might be wondering to yourself, when was the last time the United States actually ran a US national debt equal to $0? So the last time the US actually had a national debt equal to $0 was when Andrew Jackson was president. So in the mid 1800s, so 1830s, I believe that was a time period where we actually ran a zero national debt. We actually had a little bit of positive amounts of a surplus there. So we actually didn't have negative national debt. We had, so that was actually something really, really unusual during that time. And there was actually a pretty big discussion of exactly what the U.S. government should do because it no longer had a national debt. And there was some type of discussion saying that, hey, the federal government should give the surplus or the excess amount of money to states to divide it up upon their population, with the larger states getting more money, with the smaller states getting less money. But all of this talk was for nothing because we ran into a sort of housing crisis during this time period. And basically since then, we've run a deficit year after year after year, which has contributed to the large national debt that we have today. So once again, a little bit of a history lesson with all of that. So with all of this, hope that that gives you a little bit of a better idea about the similarities and differences with a deficit, surplus, and debt. And we're going to be taking a closer look at, should we be running such a large national debt? What are the implications of us having a $25 trillion national debt? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for taxpayers and our future generations? And should we be getting rid of this national debt? Should we have a zero national debt? Should we go back to Andrew Jackson's time and see exactly what is going to be the implications of that? We'll take a closer look and discussion and analysis of all of these sort of questions in the next few videos. So I'll see you guys there.